Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The first problem we want to draw attention to is the statue. It is way too high and too narrow. Its height is 60 cubits, and its breadth is 6 cubits. Now, statues normally had a ratio of length to width of about 6 to 1. Not 10 to 1, as we have here with 60 and 6 cubits. And we can tell that in the ancient world, people recognize this to be a problem. In the Greek translation of Daniel in Papyrus 967, it gives the breadth as 12 cubits to rationalize the image. So if it's 60 cubits tall and 12 cubits wide, then that would actually make sense. It wouldn't be so long and skinny. And thus we see here that efforts were made to rectify the text so that it would make better sense. Rashi claimed that the too narrow statue of Nebuchadnezzar kept falling until they brought all the gold in Jerusalem and poured layers as a base for its feet to fulfill what was said in Ezekiel, and their gold will be for an impure object. Now that is very creative, and he's kind of stringing passages together, Daniel with Ezekiel, etc. But that is very speculative. And indeed, in the modern period, there are still commentators who have attempted to rationalize this image by setting the statue on a platform. There may be other points of significance here for the height and width of the statue. The height of the statue is the same as the width of the first temple in Jerusalem and is exactly twice the first temple's height. The statue is the same height as the second temple also, according to Ezra chapter 6. The choice of the width of the statue similarly recalls the width of the support beams of both the first and second temples. Prominence of gold may reflect Solomon's use of gold in the temple, and our two Greek versions, the Old Greek and the Theodotion, also add the date of this event to the text, saying it's the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. That is the same year that Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem and captured the temple. Now, why is this important? Why does it matter that some of the dimensions that show up in the temple show up in the statue? The gold that shows up in the temple shows up in the statue, and our Greek versions are trying to coordinate this story with the capture of the temple in Jerusalem. Well, the effect is to emphasize the rivalry between Nebuchadnezzar and the God of Israel. Read this from a Jewish perspective, and you understand that to fall down and worship a statue, this is exactly antithetical to the practice of the Jews who worship the true God, the unseen God, in the temple at Jerusalem. And in order to highlight this rivalry, even though it is subtle, it's clear enough to see that an architectural dimension of the temple in Jerusalem has been brought over upon this statue in order to sort of trigger our memories, to remind us of what real worship looks like in Jerusalem and how this statue is such a poor imitation of it. Is this an image of Nebuchadnezzar, or is it an image of one of his gods? Now, Pace says that although the stories of Daniel 2 and 3 originally may have circulated as independent accounts, their current arrangement portrays a king who learns nothing from Daniel's dream interpretation. In other words, in Daniel chapter 2, we have a statue, and part of it represents Nebuchadnezzar, and this statue ends up being destroyed. Well, here we are in Daniel chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar simply hasn't learned. He's back to believing a statue will last forever, and now he is represented by the entirety of the statue. And this is part of this aspect that covers these 3 chapters, Daniel 2, 3, and 4, where God keeps on correcting Nebuchadnezzar until his education is complete, but it takes him a while to get it. We'll come back to this point. In the 3rd century, Hippolytus assumed that Nebuchadnezzar's actions were motivated by his identification with the statue of gold in the previous chapter and the pride that ensued. So Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, "You, O king, are the head of gold." Well, what does he do here? Well, he constructs a statue of his own and just makes the whole thing out of gold. His pride is running away with him. However, in verse 18, it seems to suggest that the statue is actually one of Nebuchadnezzar's gods, because what is said, "Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, there are a couple of different ways to read this sentence. You could read it that, hey, we're not going to worship your gods in general, and we're not going to worship this image of you right here. But many people see these phrases as being in parallel. We're not going to worship your gods, and therefore we're not going to worship this golden image that you have set up as one of your gods. Now, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar or whether it's one of his gods that is represented here, some have suggested that this story is unrealistic because in the ancient world, people worshipped all sorts of gods. Why would someone be mad that these Jews are unwilling to worship a Babylonian god and instead are worshiping their own god? Aren't pagan societies tolerant? Well, the answer is no. At the end of the Babylonian period, Nabonidus' attempt to foster worship of the moon god Sin evoked strenuous opposition from the priests of Marduk, who wrote a scathing satire in verse. Here is a depiction of Nabonidus that comes to us from the late Babylonian period. Notice the crescent moon in the background. Nabonidus promoted the worship of Sin more than the most traditional prominent god Marduk, and this got him a lot of opposition. As you can imagine, the priests who made up the cult of Marduk, they were used to receiving tremendous popularity and financial and state support, and now that some of that has been shifted to the cult of Sin, of the moon god, there's going to be some envy here, and there is considerable political upheaval over this. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is some would suggest that pagan societies were tolerant, and that if these 3 Jews chose not to worship this statue, if they chose to worship some other god, nobody would care because pagan societies are tolerant. Well, this is not the case. You have a number of instances in the ancient world where even though the system is polytheistic and the worship of many gods was tolerated, if within a state government, one particular god had been very popular and then suddenly he got a demotion and another god got promoted, well, the original god, his cult, his followers are going to be upset about this. So it's not at all unrealistic to suppose that 3 Jews could be persecuted for refusing to worship a certain god at this state event. All the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, Newsom points out that you have a pair of command and execution sequences. Nebuchadnezzar orders the officials to assemble, and they do. They are to prostrate themselves at the sound of the music, and they do. So there's sort of an authoritarian tone that is present here with Nebuchadnezzar. You can see this depiction of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know if he's supposed to look insane, but he does. Right? Now, the list of authority figures would bespeak oppression to the Jewish listener. If this story is being passed down in the Persian period, well, we have other texts composed at this time, such as in Nehemiah, where he talks about the former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens upon the people and took food and wine for them besides 40 shekels of silver. Yet with all this, I did not demand the food allowance of the governor because of the heavy burden of labor on the people. And so the sense of governors during the period that this passage is being written copied and passed along is one that reflects a very poor attitude toward governors. They were seen as tyrants, as oppressors. And so this is the idea here. We get all of these oppressors here, and the chief oppressor among them is Nebuchadnezzar. As Nebuchadnezzar oppresses them, so they oppress the nations. Let's read a little bit more of the text. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Comedy and satire is a form of social criticism. Now, Lucas and other scholars have pointed to mindless repetition, nonsensical listing, and humans acting as automatons as a source of comedic satire. In other words, you may read a story like this and you keep running into these long pedantic lists and other features of the story that just seem kind of silly, and out of a sense of religious pressure or your confidence in the Bible as the Word of God or whatever, you might feel like you need to suppress the feelings that this story is kind of silly. Like if I admit that this story is silly, then now I've attacked the Word of God or something like that. Well, Lucas and others will say that you're missing the point altogether. The author intends for this to be funny for his ancient audience. This is comedy, this is satire. He is trying to make fun of these pagan kings and their pagan religion. And so there are a number of features in the story that would strike an ancient Jew as kind of funny because it's making fun of their taskmasters. It's making fun of those who have control over their lives. The satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of their provinces. Now, is it really necessary for the author to give you such a long list of important people? Well, no. All right, but he's doing this because his Jewish audience, they know all these categories. They have all these bosses. There are all these people they're supposed to pay respect to. All these people who fancy themselves as being so important and so powerful. And so he lists them as sort of an exhaustive list here, because you can kind of see the Jew just sort of rolling his eyes as you get these long lists of self-conceived important people. Same thing with the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music. Scholars who know something about music, they look at this list here and they say it doesn't even make sense, that if you mix these instruments, it's going to sound bad. So look how stupid Nebuchadnezzar looks. He wants all these instruments played and everybody to fall down and worship this statue. And this big important orchestra wouldn't even sound that good. It's just a long pedantic list of musical instruments that don't even go together. Nebuchadnezzar commands the furnace to be heated 7 times its normal heat, which is both impossible and a commentary on his lack of self-control. Nebuchadnezzar has his strongest men bind the 3 Jews. Well, that's overkill. Again, it's a commentary on Nebuchadnezzar's need to appear so powerful. Why would he need his biggest, buffest men to bind these 3 Jews? Any of his soldiers could have done it. And the 3 strong men, of course, are the ones who get burned up by the furnace. The Jews would probably think this is particularly funny, kind of like slapstick humor. You know, Larry puts down a banana peel, hoping that Mo is going to slip on it and bust his head. But Larry is so mindless, he forgets what he's doing, and he ends up stepping on it and busting his own head. Well, that's the idea here. These big, strong guys are going to throw the Jews into the furnace, and they're the ones who end up getting burned up by it themselves. The 3 Jews' clothing does not even smell like smoke. These overstatements, they're funny. You know, God so whooped and embarrassed Nebuchadnezzar that not only did Nebuchadnezzar's men get burned up and the 3 Jewish boys didn't, but even their clothes didn't smell like smoke. And finally, all of this is because the statue that Nebuchadnezzar loved so much that he claims to be a god. Well, the statue is stupidly built. Right? We talked about this a few moments ago. So you have all these features. In taking them all together, there are scholars who say this story is meant to be a little bit funny. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing serious here, that there's no important points in the life of faith to be derived from this text, but you need to give the human author room to be human. If he wants to crack a joke at the expense of his enemies, then you must allow him to do so. Right? This is a form of social criticism. You know, the Jews are living under the harsh whips of their pagan taskmasters. You can't expect them to never write any literature making fun of their governors. Well, this is an example of that. So if you see aspects in this story that seem kind of silly to you, it's because it's meant to be silly. You don't have to suppress that. You're not dishonoring the Word of God if you admit that. It's silly because it's meant to be silly, because the author has a sense of humor. He is writing satire. On a more serious note, some have referred to this as evidence of the first religious persecution. As Longman said, this account may be the first record of specifically religious persecution, but unfortunately not the last. A moment ago, I talked about how the priests of Marduk were in competition with the priests of Sin in Babylon. But that's persecution within the family. That's, one pagan gets mad at another because a certain god got promoted and another god got demoted. But in terms of a person who belongs to a particular religious tradition or system persecuting someone who belongs to a different religious system, this may be the first evidence of that. Now, are these the only Jews to resist idolatry? Is it just these three? I mean, it kind of seems like it. If they're the only three that are pointed out as being resistors and thrown into the furnace, this may be a sad social commentary. It may suggest that other Jews were compromised. But Pace responds to this by saying the author tells the reader that the Chaldeans denounced the Jews in general in verse 8, allowing for the possibility that all exiles in the empire are threatened by the accusation. So based on which aspect of the chapter you emphasize, you can speculate that these three are unique Jews in the sense that they weren't compromised, or you can look at verse 8 and see that there are uncompromised Jews throughout the diaspora, throughout the region of exile. What about Daniel? Did he compromise? You will notice that these three Jews are thrown into the furnace, and Daniel is not. He's not even mentioned. Some have suggested then that Daniel might have compromised here, and that's why his life is not threatened. But Longman suggests that Daniel chapter 2, verse 49 in the last chapter is the answer. At Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. In other words, since the end of chapter 2, Daniel and his three friends have had separate jobs, and therefore they may be in separate locations. And it's not that Daniel was compromised by this event. He just may be somewhere else doing something else. There are a multiplicity of places in the book of Daniel that have inspired content in the book of Revelation. In this scene where the three Hebrew boys' lives are in jeopardy because they refuse to bow down and worship an image, this has inspired some of the language and one of the most memorable passages in the book of Revelation. In chapter 13, then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. Now this part. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. In the Revelation literature, New Testament scholars recognize that this points back to this passage in Daniel chapter 3. And it likely had very specific meaning for the original audience of the book of Revelation. Remember that Revelation is addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and the first one listed is Ephesus. And Ephesus at the time was the headquarters of the emperor cult. Emperor Domitian, his statue you can see here on the left, and the remains of his temple is on the right. Christians in Ephesus would have been expected, along with the rest of the population, to burn incense to this statue and declare the divinity of Domitian. And obviously, a Christian cannot do that. And so, at best, many Christians were facing, financial sanctions, and at worst, their lives were in jeopardy. And so, a Christian in Ephesus or in this area, they would read Revelation 13 and they would know exactly what the author is talking about. He's drawing on an analogous situation back in the book of Daniel to describe a situation of persecution that the original audience of Revelation that was already undergoing, and that itself would show up again and again throughout church history until the final generation preceding the second coming of Christ. Also, this passage had influence on Christians in Rome. Emperor Nero set the city on fire, or at least escalated the fire that had already been set by accident, and then he needed a scapegoat, and so he pinned it on Christians, and thus began the first imperial persecution of Christians at the city of Rome. Now, in the catacombs, we find artwork in honor of Christian martyrs, where we have the 3 Jews in the fire. And Christians seem to have adopted this image and been inspired by it, while Christians were not being saved out of the fire. There's a sense in which they were. They would go into the fire and they would come out on the other side because of the resurrection, because of eternal life. And so this image was reinterpreted to apply to their situation of persecution in the early church. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Whatever else we may take away from this story, we should at the very least see an example of courage that's worthy of imitation. When I got to this text, it made me think there are so many different spheres in life in which Christians need more courage, whether it be the workplace, academia, family, sharing our faith, personal risk, financial risk, etc. There are so many different levels in which Christians have failed to show courage, and it's a crippling problem. If you do something for the Lord and you lack wisdom, well, you can work that out in time. You can fix your mistakes as you go, as you learn, as you get more experience. That's fine. If you do something and your motives are not totally pure, the Lord can bring that to your attention and you can fix your bad motives. But the problem with fear is it's the ultimate non-starter. It's not as though you do something for the Lord and you can fix it later. If you're afraid, you won't do anything for the Lord. Fear is what cripples us in the life of faith more than anything. And in all these spheres, I think Christians oftentimes have opportunities to witness, to do things for the Lord, and we don't do them just because of fear. The workplace obviously is a big example of this. I remember as a new Christian, 18, 19 years old, I went to work at Wendy's. I was a cashier, and one of the only heretical Christian groups I knew anything about were the Mormons. And some Mormon missionaries came in, and I began to witness to them, even though I was on the clock. And specifically, I confronted them about their teaching that black people have the curse of Cain. And I did this in front of black coworkers. Obviously, as you can imagine, these Mormon missionaries were very uncomfortable. Afterwards, my manager pulled me aside, and my manager was a minister, and he said, "Are you the one who began the conversation about religion today on the clock?" And I told him, yes, I was. And on a personal level, he sort of congratulated me. He said, "I think it's a good thing you did that." And then he was like, "And by the way, don't do it again, right? Because you're on the clock." And I think there are times like that when Christians have to make a decision. What matters most to you? Is it your paycheck or your faith? Academia. This is a sphere in which an an instance in which Christians oftentimes feel especially fearful. Even in seminary, in seminary I found that almost everyone is a liberal, and alternative forms of sexual expression and marriage. People oftentimes in a seminary atmosphere endorse those things in God's name, and there have been instances where if I didn't speak out on behalf of biblical sexuality and biblical marriage, nobody in the room was going to do so. And sometimes that had good results. I remember a particular instance where I had prepared remarks and had a little spill. There were other traditional, biblically minded Christians in the room, but they seemed too afraid to say anything. So I gave my spill, and I loved the results. The professor reacted positively, even though I knew he was a liberal. Other liberal students in the class who had been very loud, they shut up. They were quiet. There are other instances like I wrote a paper one time for an Old Testament professor. She responded. She said, "Hey, this is PhD quality work. We really like this." Well, then I wrote the next paper defending biblical sexuality and marriage, and as you can imagine, I did not get the same response. She was bothered. She seemed to be offended. I seemed to strike a nerve, and she was very critical. And so that's just going to happen. If your faith doesn't cost you anything, then it's not worth anything. And all Christians, especially in our culture, we need to be more courageous. And if we are reading this story right, it should have that effect on us. Idolatry. Tillich pointed out that a person's God is the thing or person that one is most concerned about, thinks the most about, or affects one's life the most. What you have on your screen right now comes from a book on data research science, and what it wants to show us are the things that people think about the most. Now, you can't just survey people. We find in surveys that people are dishonest and that they have bad memories. If you ask people in our culture, how many of you voted, and you take that survey and you compare it with the actual number of people who voted, you'll find that a lot of people have lied. You can't just trust surveys. And so research scientists are trying to find better ways to get the truth about people. What are people really thinking? What are people doing? And so what you have here are the most common searches on Google for 19 to 22-year-olds. And we'll look at other age clusters here in a moment. And if we can just look at what people are searching up, their search engines, with the privacy of their own computers, we can really see what people's idols are. What do they think about the most? Now, the biggest words are the ones that get searched for the most, and the smallest words are the ones that get searched for the least. Now, you can see here in the middle immediately semester. All right, this is the biggest word on the screen, next, of course, to the F word, which shows up a number of different places in association with a number of different words. You have your profanity cluster down here. These words are oftentimes searched for in relationship to one another. Up here, you get schedule, registered, class, etc. You get another cluster of words over here that go together: exam, class, science, lecture, psychology, professor. In the biggest cluster, of course, you get a mixture of profanity in with stuff that has to do with school. Campus is a big word. In the library is a common phrase. Go to class, bitches. Bitches is right there with the other words. Down here in the bottom right, you get another cluster of words that is commonly searched for: drunk, hangover, hungover, drunken, sober, etc. And so what you see here is a common idol for people this age is education. And I I just finished my 3rd degree. I'm all for education. I like education. But if you've ever been around somebody this age who's at the university, you know how annoying they can be because all they want to talk about is themselves, this school, this class, what my schedule is like this semester, what assignment I'm working on right now. And it's all very fine and good. But I think a lot of Christians get hung up in this. They get swept away by it, where they end up with this syndrome where all they can talk about are the classes I'm taking and the schedule I have right now, and they're not thinking about the Lord very much at all. Here's the next age bracket, ages 23 to 29 years old. And again, we have clusters of words associated together. Reality is hit like a freight train here. These words are used together. Money, pay, paid, bills, month, rent, taxes, etc. I think you would expect that in this age bracket. Over here, we have beer and drinking. The words aren't quite as extreme as when they were in college, where it was drunk and hungover, etc. Now it's just more casual alcohol is, I guess, what you could take away from this. Maybe not. We have beer over here in this cluster. Very big word, one of the biggest on the screen. At work, right? How many people make an idol out of their careers and out of their jobs? And look here, we actually have a religious word. We don't have Jesus. We don't have repent. We don't have scripture. We don't have Bible. We have blessed, right? It's about what you can get from God, not what you can give to him. New job is a big one. Yard work, schedule is up here. Apartment, house, place, etc. Some of these, I think, just simply reflect this period in life. I mean, many of these are natural, but many of these, I think, reflect the reality that in our culture we've set people up to think that what's most important is that you go to school and then you get a career and then you start a family. But all of these things are bad if they're more important to you than the Lord. 30 to 65-year-olds, daughters seem to be a big concern for people in this bracket. My kids, my son, Facebook friends, a lot of social media type stuff. Repost as in repost a Facebook thing. Facebook friends up here. Husband, your status for is a popular phrase. Your status for Facebook, etc. These sorts of things. Over here's another cluster: son, proud, youngest, dad, mother, daughter. We actually get God. God shows up in this cluster. Fairly big word. Prayer, prayers. Even in this cluster, it's bigger than the word bless. I mean, maybe in this age bracket, people are beginning to think less of just getting something, bless, and more about these other things, devotional things, prayer, God, etc. Life comes on. People, I think, begin to feel dissatisfied with what the culture has to offer. They're reminded of their own mortality, the fact that they're going to die. Maybe there's just an intuitive sense that seeks God that is no longer suppressed by the constant pursuit of a job or of a major. And maybe for these reasons, this age bracket is thinking a little bit more about God. But they're not thinking about God near as much as they're thinking about family. It was so interesting. We went through the Gospel of Luke. It took us a whole year. And we found that many of the people who will fail on Judgment Day are those who were so busy with family and career and property acquisition that they did not have time for the kingdom. We tend to think that good family men are going to be okay on Judgment Day. Not so, says Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. People oftentimes are going to miss the kingdom of God because they are distracted with what might otherwise be good and necessary things, like family, like their marital relationship, like their careers. All these things must be secondary. You have to love Jesus more than you love your spouse. You have to love Jesus more than you love your children, more than you love yourself, more than you love your career, more than you love your education. If Jesus is not first, you will not succeed on Judgment Day. Now we'll just divide it according to gender. And this is where it gets almost entertaining. So we get wishes he. I don't know why that phrase would be so big. I guess it reflects some kind of desire. Of course, we get the F word for men. in addition to Xbox, Black Ops. Here's Modern Warfare over here. I'm kind of convicted because I like this game. LeBron, as in LeBron James. And then we get a cluster of cuss words over here. We get some cuss words mixed in this cluster. Of course, we have government and country and freedom and rights. People oftentimes care more about their country than they do about the church. Of course, with men, you're going to have this battle and fight and fighting and winning and victory and defeat and all these things. Not to mention this, people at my church have a tendency to get much more excited when they talk about football than when they talk about the Lord. Again, more video games down here. Entertainment is killing the American church. We want to be entertained. We don't want to be sanctified. Females. Now this is interesting. I think that women must be so excited to go shopping. Our two biggest words up here are excited and shopping. Right? And we also have chocolate, and we have boyfriend, and we have yay, we have yummy, we have mommy, we have cute, we have a couple of interesting clusters, these little emoticons, if that's even what you call them. I don't do these so much. Boyfriend, besties. We have the word so. We got so with 2 O's, so with 3 O's, so with 4 O's. I don't even know how many O's are here, but it seems there's no cuss words. You'll notice that. It seems as where men like to cuss, women just like to say so with a bunch of O's. And so this is the reality for women. What about language that reflects faith? Well, we have blessed. They seem to be seeking to get something from God. As I look across this page, I may be missing it somewhere, but I don't see any other words that reflect faith commitment. I think we just have blessed. And so that's what we learn about what people are thinking, right? When we look at what they're searching for on Google. And I think it's a depressing picture for the most part. People are making an idol based on where they are in life, whether it be partying, whether it be the number of searches. A lot of the profanity reflects searches for pornographic websites. Women here seem to have a thing for shopping. That's an awfully big word. And excitement. They want exciting experiences in life. The men are sitting around playing video games and watching football. I mean, all these stupid things that have no eternal value. This is what is preoccupying our thoughts. And I think Christians need to escape from Mystery Babylon. We need to escape from this materialism, from this constant pursuit of entertainment. These things are going to choke us out if we're not careful. Idolatry is also a matter of self-worship. Nietzsche, who defines postmodern pluralism, he is seen as the standard bearer for the postmodern culture in which we now find ourselves. He says, "But let me reveal my heart to you entirely, my friends. If there were gods, how could I endure not to be a god? Hence, there are no gods." Now, Longman is writing at the end of the 20th century, and he's responding to Nietzsche. He says, "Here is the heart of modern, postmodern society. In the absence of the gods, we may and must create our own meaning. No longer does Christ provide meaning. No longer do we feel the existential nausea of no meaning. Now we feel the will to power and the joy in constructing our own meaning in the absence of the gods." So what he is talking about here is the shift from modernism to postmodernism. In the 20th century, at the height of modernism, you can see this, for example, in the writings of C.S. Lewis in Britain, where people were giving up God, they were giving up Christianity, and they were saying, now that we don't have Christ, now that we don't have the Bible, how do we define our meaning? How do we define our purpose? How do we define our standard of ethics? Without God, there seems to be this big absence, this void. And then postmodernism comes along and says, you can define your own meaning, that you can define your own reality. You have your interpretation, I have mine. You have your version of truth, I have mine. You have God as you see him. I have God as I see him. Neither one of us needs to be wrong. We just need to respect each other's constructed versions of reality. Longman continues. He says, all substitutes for God are ultimately this idol, the idol of self. And as the end of the 20th century is in the process of discovering, this idol does not lead to life, but to death, cultural and individual. If we are left to do what is right in our own eyes and to define reality for ourselves and to come up with our own meaning, ultimately everyone is going to be selfish. Because if you get to define reality, you are going to define a reality that is based on you, that is based on your desires, your preferences, your wants. You are God in postmodern society. And I think that the results of this, as Longman says, are very dangerous because there's not an objective, higher, transcendent meaning of morality anymore. If morality is subjective, then you will see the way that people treat one another. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace was overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Now, some might wonder, is there any historical evidence that if a person is accused of blasphemy within the ancient Babylonian context, that they would be burned up like this? Is this a fiction that is being created by the author, or is this the sort of thing that could actually happen in Babylonian history and context? A Babylonian school text from the early 6th century BC reports a king's punishment of blasphemous temple officials with the command, destroy them, burn them, roast them, to the cook's oven, make their smoke billow, bring about their fiery end with the fierce flame of the box thorn. And so we can see here that we have other stories to this effect that show up in the ancient Babylonian world. Now, Newsom tries to help us imagine this. She says, although the furnace has not been described physically, it appears to have been open at the top since the Jews were lifted or carried up and fell into the furnace. The king, however, seems to be looking into the furnace from the side, and the 3 Jews come out rather than up from the furnace in verse 26. Montgomery suggests that it may be envisioned as analogous to the structure of a lime kiln, with both top and side openings. So maybe something like this. Intertextual connections. And we've already seen that the book of Daniel looks back to the story of Joseph in Genesis a number of times, but does it look back to other Old Testament stories? Well, maybe. In verse 15, and who is the God who will deliver you out of my hand? Well, this may echo Deuteronomy 32. Yahweh declares, there is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and no one can deliver you from my hand. And so the king looks here to be very blasphemous. He is trying to claim for himself a sort of power that belongs to Yahweh alone. Another echo that scholars identify is when the Assyrians laid siege to Jerusalem and one of their men is taunting and trying to intimidate the people of Jerusalem. And do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands has delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? So if this echo is intentional, as some people think, then it's comparing Nebuchadnezzar to this pompous man who is eventually going to be defeated and overthrown by the Lord. But more than any of these, the image of the fire that does not burn most directly evokes the theophany of God to Moses in Exodus 3. Now think about this. This is the beginning of the making of the covenant. This is the beginning of salvation, where Yahweh is going to bring the people out, and they're going to be his people, and they're going to follow his laws. And it begins with this image of something that is in the fire, but it's not burnt up. Well, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they have been faithful to that very same covenant that was formed at Sinai. And so now they are in the fire, but they are not being burned up. There is an intentional irony here, just as this is the image that attends the inauguration of this covenant at Sinai. So this is the image that attends the salvation of the men who obeyed the covenant that was made at Sinai. At this point in Daniel chapter 3, there is some divergence between the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible. And the reason for that is the Protestant Bible follows the Hebrew Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament. What books the Jews decided to put in the Bible, these would end up becoming the Protestant Old Testament. Well, the Catholics did not follow the Jews on this. The Catholics went with the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. It had some extra books in it that Jews did not come to recognize as being authoritative. But for Catholics, those books are authoritative. And the Septuagint also has some of these additions to books like Esther and Daniel, etc. And so even though I'm not Catholic, I think a number of Catholics will watch this and a number of Protestants will watch this and wonder about the extra material in Daniel chapter 3 in the Catholic Bible. And I want to very quickly go over this material and discuss something of its provenance, where it came from. First, it begins with the prayer of Azariah, one of the three Jews who was thrown into the furnace. They walked around in the midst of the flames, singing hymns to God and blessing the Lord. Then Azariah stood still in the fire and prayed aloud, Blessed are you, O Lord, God of our ancestors, and worthy of praise, and glorious is your name forever. You have executed true judgments, and all you have brought upon us and upon Jerusalem, the holy city of our ancestors, by a true judgment. You have brought all this upon us because of our sins. For we have sinned and broken your law in turning away from you. In all matters we have sinned grievously. You have handed us over to our enemies, lawless and hateful rebels, and to an unjust king, the most wicked in all the world. All right, so the prayer of Azariah, the Jews recognize their own guilt, and they castigate Nebuchadnezzar as the most wicked ruler in all of the world. I don't have the whole thing here. I just kind of pulled this out as a sampling. Then there's a brief story. Now the king's servants who threw them in kept stoking the furnace with naphtha, pitch, tow, and brushwood. And the flames poured out above the furnace 49 cubits and spread out and burned those Chaldeans who were caught near the furnace. But the angel of the Lord came down into the furnace to be with Azariah and his companions, and drove the fiery flame out of the furnace, and made the inside of the furnace as though a moist wind were whistling through it. The fire did not touch them at all, and caused them no pain or distress. Then after the narrative, you have a prayer of the three youths after they've been delivered from the fire. Then the three, with one voice, praised and glorified and blessed God in the furnace. Blessed are you, O Lord, God of our ancestors, and to be praised and highly exalted forever. Bless the Lord. And he's going to go through the days of creation here. All right, that's what he's going to do. Mountains and hills sing praises to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, all that grows on the ground. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, seas and rivers. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, you springs. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, you wells and all that swim in the waters. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, all birds of the air. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, all wild animals and cattle. Sing praise to him and highly exalt him forever. Bless the Lord, all people on earth. All right, and so these beautiful doxological sections that attribute great things to God and call this creation to worship its creator. Now, you may listen to what I'm saying and ask the question, so what is the original version? Is the Catholic version with this extra material, is it more original, or was this added later after the original composition? Well, even sophisticated Catholics recognize that the sections we just read were not originally in the story. They're not bothered by that for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. But John J. Collins is a Roman Catholic. He's an excellent Bible scholar. Presumably, he believes that these sections are inspired, and he's glad they're in the Catholic Bible, but he explains how we know that they are later additions. He says, "The prayer and the song were certainly not composed for this context. The prayer is especially inappropriate because it is a communal confession of sin, whereas the three youths have been punished for their uncompromising fidelity to their God. So these three guys are in there confessing sin when they didn't do anything wrong. They're in the fire because they're courageous, because they're faithful, not because they're unfaithful. Neither composition has any specific connection with the book of Daniel, except for one verse at the very end of the song. And so since there's nothing in the song that points to things earlier in Daniel, or points to things later on in Daniel, it doesn't look like this song was originally composed for the book of Daniel. It looks like it's a song that got dropped in here after the fact. The executioners were already killed in the earlier verse, but they continue to stoke the furnace in verse 46. So obviously that is a very incohesive part of the narrative. It is true that the prose interlude makes little sense after the prayer of Azariah. Azariah could hardly have recited this long prayer in the middle of the fire before the miraculous intervention. How long can you pray in the fire waiting for God to intervene on your behalf? It says that there is neither prince nor prophet. Israel could scarcely be said to be without a prophet in the exilic period. However, prophecy was widely believed to have ceased in the post-exilic period. And so much later on, this song was likely written and then dropped in here. As for the original story of Daniel, composed in the exilic period, it would not say that there is no prince or prophet. In the exile, there were certainly prophets. The period when everyone believed there was no prince or prophet, this comes later on in history after the book of Daniel was composed. And so we have evidence here that it is a later composition that has been added to Daniel. So the question is, how did this additional material end up in the book of Daniel? Well, to make this point, I want to kind of show a tree of the copy history of the book of Daniel. It was originally written in Aramaic, and it did not have this material. Then sometime afterwards, you end up with the tradition that shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls in Aramaic also do not contain this material. Well, there was another branch of copyist tradition that leads to the Masoretic text, which is the basis for the Jewish and the Protestant Bibles, do not contain this material. And then finally, at some point when the book was still in Aramaic, these additions were made. Then it was translated into Greek in the version that we call the Old Greek. It contains the additions, as well as a different tradition, the Theodotion, which also contains these traditions. And again, the Catholic version is based on these Greek versions, as where the Protestant version is based on the Masoretic text. And so are Catholics bothered by this? You'll find that the answer is no. A sophisticated Catholic is going to say that it's okay that we have additional material in our Bible. It could also be inspired by God, because even in the Protestant Bible, the Protestant version of Daniel is a series of additions. I mean, scholars, Protestant and Catholic, believe that the final chapters of this book were written well after the initial chapters. I discussed this in the introduction. And so there's a sense in which a large part of the book of Daniel is composed of additions that came later after the original composition. Well, if the Catholic version of the story has an extra level of additions that the Protestant version doesn't have, they're going to say, so what? Both of our versions ultimately consist of a lot of extra additions that came after the time of the original composition. And so you will find that a sophisticated Catholic person is not going to be bothered by this. Now I want to return to the part of the story that is in both the Protestant and the Catholic Bibles. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Who is the fourth figure in the fire? Uh, Nebuchadnezzar says the fourth is like a son of the gods. Now, from his perspective, this could actually be a divine being. However, it's unlikely that he thinks this because in verse 28 he says that the Hebrew God has sent his angel. And so he may not think of this as being an actual God, as some commentators have stated. He explicitly calls it an angel. Now, because he says this, according to one tradition in Judaism, Yorkami, the angel of hell, offered to quench the fire, but Gabriel emphasized that the miracle would be more arresting if he, the angel of fire, would protect the three while simultaneously increasing the heat outside the furnace. Again, Jewish exegesis is very imaginative. The Talmud highlights their nobility. Even in the face of Gabriel's intervention, the three men made it possible for the angel to withstand the fire of the furnace, and not the reverse, says some rabbis. They represent the righteousness of humankind, who are even greater than that of the angels. Thus Gabriel followed them as a disciple, a master. And so this is a very interesting aspect in Jewish tradition where we don't want to give too much credit to the angel. We want to give credit to these righteous Jews who obeyed the commandments of the Lord. The non-consuming fire connects him to the angel of the Lord in Exodus 3. We talked about this a moment ago, how there's fire on the burning bush and it's not consumed. Well, there's fire on these men and they're not consumed. Well, in Exodus 3, the angel of the Lord gets mentioned, and so here the angel of the Lord gets mentioned. And sometimes the angel of the Lord is Yahweh in human form. He's a kind of incarnation, and so it may be that that is who we are dealing with here. Or it may be that as a member of the divine council of Yahweh, but we will discuss the divine council in heaven in the next chapter. Nebuchadnezzar still doesn't get it. He begins the chapter by protecting his idol with the threat of death. He ends the chapter by trying to protect Yahweh with the threat of death. Both make the king the protector of the deity, thus confusing the issue of the nature, source, and uses of royal and divine power. Although Nebuchadnezzar answers his own earlier rhetorical question about the existence of a God who can save persons from his hand, the irony of his second command and the lack of understanding it reflects shows that the truth remains hidden from him. Despite the apparent resolution of the conflict, the education of King Nebuchadnezzar is not yet complete. That's what we're doing here. Daniel 2, Daniel 3, and Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar keeps learning these lessons, but he doesn't get it. He thought he was going to protect his idol with the threat of death. And now that he's convinced of Yahweh's existence and Yahweh's power, now he thinks he's going to protect Yahweh with the threat of death. Well, Yahweh is not like one of his idols, right? That's what he's doing. He simply made this transference. He protected idols. Now he's going to protect Yahweh. But Yahweh is not an idol that needs protection. And therefore, we'll have one more story with Nebuchadnezzar where finally his education will stick and he's going to get it. What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We don't know. The Talmud considers various possibilities. Whither did the rabbis or the three men go? Rob said they died through an evil eye. The evil eye refers to the awe or malice of other people or nations who were struck by the importance of the miracle. Samuel said they drowned in the spittle. The spittle refers to the evil intentions of other nations. Rabbi Jonathan said they went up to Palestine, married, and beget sons and daughters. Well, thank you very much, rabbis, but you don't know. Nobody knows. Daniel just simply doesn't tell us. I want to give the last word to Martin Luther King Jr., who alluded to this text when he was marching for black civil rights. He said, "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law." Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evinced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar, on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians, who were willing to face hungry lions in the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire.